The world has come to recognize Adolf Hitler as the most heinous human being to ever live. He set off what became the worst conflict in human history, intended to wipe out an entire race, and gave way to atrocities committed by both sides. His horrible deeds are what will be remembered by history, but the German people of World War II will recall the zeal, determination, and drive he showed. As the war entered its final years and Germany was facing inevitable defeat, Adolf Hitler was a very different man than he was before the war. So what was the cause of this? There were rumors that he suffered from Parkinson's disease and last-stage syphilis. Let's uncover the mystery of Hitler's illness. On the 21st of April in 1945, physician Ernst Günther Schenk was called to Adolf Hitler's bunker in Berlin to refill food supplies. What he found was not the dynamic, charming, and powerful Führer who had enchanted an entire nation. Instead, Schenk saw a live body, a spirit that had already passed away. He slouched forward until his shoulders were rounded like a turtle, his back was arched, and his shoulder blades protruded from the gap in his back. Looking directly into Death's eyes, he saw the hopelessness of his efforts. The guy who stood before Schenk had the mental and physical decline of a person who was at least 30 years older than the actual 56-year-old Hitler. It was the end of an era for the symbol of a country at war. Hitler was well aware of the physical deterioration he was experiencing. That is why he drove the war into a do-or-die situation. He would rather see Germany utterly destroyed than surrender. After the war, many stories and explanations were made to clarify the precipitous fall of the Führer. Could it have been chronic syphilis? Parkinson's disease? Maybe it was just the strain of leading a country that was fighting on many fronts. Since childhood, Hitler had been beset by stomach issues. He suffered from debilitating stomach cramps and diarrhea daily, both of which would become more severe when he was under a lot of stress. As Hitler aged, they became even more severe. Hitler's ailment was one of the reasons that forced him to become a vegetarian in 1933. He gave up meat, rich foods, and milk, and switched his diet with one that was high in greens and healthy grains. Still, his problems continued and even became worse as the pressures of leadership in the war took their toll on him. His mental health was linked to his physical health, and the Führer cycled between periods of excellent health and periods of excruciating pain throughout his life. So to continue serving his nation, Hitler chose Dr. Thomas Morell to be his physician, who was lacking in his abilities as a physician according to Hitler's generals. But still, despite the abundance of resources that were available to Hitler at the time, Morell was appointed because he was a trendy doctor who had a client base of high society types as his patients. These patients reacted well to his rapid treatments and flattery. In one of his more extraordinary measures, Morell prescribed Hitler a drug called Mutaflor. Back then, nobody knew too much about the side effects of the drug, and it was believed that Mutaflor could treat digestive disorders by removing the bad bacteria in a person's stomach and replacing them with good bacteria. People fell for it, especially Hitler, who started using it. And Morell also had a financial interest in Mutaflor, so he proved to be quite convincing. Also, Hitler's digestive difficulties had an obvious psychological relationship, and it just so happened that Morell's therapy coincided with the good patch in Hitler's career, mental condition, and therefore his health. Morell accepted the credit that Hitler had attributed to him, and he remained at the side of the Führer practically to the very end. Over the years, Morell prescribed a long list of medications, along with enzymes, liver extracts, hormones, sedatives, muscle relaxants, morphine derivatives, laxatives, and several other medications. By the early 1940s, Hitler may have been using as many as 92 different medicines. Erwin Giesling, a visiting expert in July 1944, saw that Hitler took 6 little black tablets with each of his meals. Giesling did some further research and found out that they were Dr. Custer's anti-gas pills, which were a cure for Hitler's meteorism, often referred to as chronic flatulence. Both Nux vomica and belladonna were found in these tablets, both of which are known poisons. Strychnine found in Nux vomica is the toxic component that's often used in poisons to kill rats. Atropine found in belladonna is a hallucinogen that, if used in sufficient doses, can result in death. When Hitler came to know of this, unbelievably, he did not react abruptly when he learned that he was being given 2 different poisons. For all he knew, these were merely charcoal pills to absorb his digestive stench. Even though he cut down on his intake, his condition continued to deteriorate. But what exactly was the root of his rapidly deteriorating health? By this point, Hitler seemed to be nearing the end of his life. His emotions and actions were becoming more unpredictable, and he had begun to tremble. As it turned out, for Hitler to properly move and show himself as a solid character to his people, he had to take some 30 tablets in one sitting. A far more likely culprit were the various secretive injections that Morell had administered over several years. Late in 1943, when the tide of the war began to shift against Germany, Hitler started taking these injections more often. More and more of the drugs Hitler used built up a tolerance, so Morell had to raise the dose. According to testimonies of eyewitnesses, Hitler often injected himself with drugs that provided him with a surge of energy. He would take them in the hours leading up to important announcements or speeches so that he could maintain his normally energetic and aggressive posture. The fact that Hitler was pepped up by the injections and the fact that he had developed a resistance to them shows that these were not vitamins. The tremor and irregular pulse that were seen in Adolf Hitler during the latter years of his life may have been indications of late-stage syphilis. This would mean that he had been infected with syphilis for a considerable amount of time. In his youth, Hitler was diagnosed with syphilis and was treated in Passewalk Hospital to get treatment for the disease. He got treated for it, but the symptoms reappeared in 1937, and by the beginning of 1942, it was clear that the man was suffering from growing syphilitic paralysis. Far more likely, Hitler was regularly taking amphetamines. Amphetamine use, even for a short period, can cause several unpleasant physical effects, including insomnia and loss of appetite. When used for a longer time, its psychological effects become significantly more problematic. The ability of the user to think rationally and behave sensibly is significantly hindered as a result of its use. This perfectly matches the symptoms that Hitler had. His mental illness was mirrored in his leadership, which included making such insane judgments as instructing his subordinates to hang on to every inch of terrain they could get their hands on. The most notable consequence of this was the unbelievable slaughter that occurred at Stalingrad. In 1941, German troops began an invasion of the Soviet Union, and by the summer of 1942, they had reached the outskirts of Stalingrad, today known as Volgograd. After severe street fighting, they were finally able to approach the city center, where they were met by resolute resistance from the Red Army, headed by Vasily Zhukov. The German army, headed by Friedrich Paulus, eventually surrendered in February 1943 with a total of 91,000 men after being trapped and counterattacked by the Soviet Union in November. There were 800,000 fatalities in the part of the Axis armies. The fight was significant because it was the point at which the German push into Soviet territory reach the farthest. Indeed, Hitler seemed acutely aware of his decline and was therefore prepared to make sweeping, brash decisions that would speed up the end of the war one way or another. In his time, he would rather see Germany razed to the ground than to tamely surrender. His physical condition became noticeably worse as time went on as well. He had many obsessive tendencies, like chewing the flesh on his fingers and scratching the back of his neck until it got infected. The shaking in his body got so severe that it became difficult for him to walk, and he also had a major decline in his cardiovascular health. At the time of his last public appearance, which took place only days before his death on the grounds of the new Reich Chancellery building, Hitler was hunched over, stumbling when he walked, and was unable to stop his left arm, which he held behind him, from quivering. He was reviewing and congratulating young troops for their achievements in the Battle of Berlin against the Soviet Red Army. His eyes were glassy, his skin was oily, and his voice was sometimes so soft that it was difficult to understand what he was saying. He gave off the appearance of being considerably older than his real age of 56, and he bore little resemblance to the flamboyant orator who had carried the Nazi Party to power. Some even alleged that Hitler had monarchism, the medical condition of having only one testicle. In 1916, a German doctor, Johann Jambor, came across a wounded Adolf Hitler during the Battle of the Somme. Apparently, Jambor said that Hitler suffered a groin injury in the battle and in fact lost a testicle. But should the question of whether or not Hitler had a single testicle really have any bearing on our understanding of Hitler's policies? Perhaps the Führer had three, which made things difficult for him. Who knows? Even if it were shown without a reasonable doubt that Adolf Hitler was a sadomasochist, how does that further any scientific interests? Does this make the so-called final solution of the Jewish question more easily understandable, or does it make the twisted route to Auschwitz the one-way street of a psychopath in power? Whatever the answer may be, let's go back to the subject of Hitler's health. When Hitler, who was paranoid that his generals would drug him and take him into the mountains of southern Germany rather than allowing him to meet certain death in Berlin, accused Morell of trying to drug him on April 21, 1945, he was finally and overduly fired. In the end, Hitler decided to end his life on his own terms, and he did so by a gunshot in the bunker in Berlin. It's hard to imagine that he would have allowed himself to have been taken alive by the Allies. Even if he did, it's unlikely that he would have lived for very long. One could never claim that Hitler was a rational actor, but his rapid psychological breakdown raises several troubling suppositions. If Hitler had access to apocalyptic weapons, there is a very good chance that he would have used them, even if the cause he was fighting for was doomed to fail. What was it that drove the Nazis to use gas chambers to hold out one of the worst genocide operations in the history of the human race? There is no easygoing means to portray this horrifyingly brutal and atrocious historical episode. The year 1939. Unrest was about to boil over in Europe. Now that Adolf Hitler was fully in control of Germany, the Nazi Party was wielding a stranglehold over the country. Anti-Semitic speeches by Hitler and his allies led many to believing that the Jews in Germany and Europe as a whole were the root of all the nation's problems. That's why, as the Nazis took control of Germany, they started to strip Jews of their property, liberties, and legal rights. During the German conquest of Poland in 1939, Polish Jews were deported to ghettos in the country where they were isolated from the rest of the population. There were certainly more groups that Hitler sought to eradicate, In addition to those who opposed him politically, he considered that citizens like homosexuals, members of the Roma minority, and those who were mentally or physically disabled had no right to be in German society. The Nazis wanted to capture and eventually exterminate these people. But when World War II broke, the Nazis did not have a blueprint to exterminate Jews and other people they despised. And in order to execute this plan of mass murder, it meant seeking the most effective ways to carry it out. The methods changed over time, particularly from 1939 to 1941, when they experimented with a range of means. The camp commanders, particularly those in Germany and Poland, experimented with a number of ways to mass murder prisoners and shared their successes and failures with one another. It took years of work to get a single camp to the point where it could execute 2,000 to 3,000 individuals an hour. At first, mass murder was done at close range, man to man, woman, or child. In 1941, SS General Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski told his superior Heinrich Himmler that the Nazis had been murdering Jews, including women and children, at close range and in cold blood all summer. Bach-Zelewski was worried about his methods' traumatizing effects on his men. Himmler wrote down the general's worries in his diary about his soldiers, stating, "These men are done for the rest of their lives. What type of disciples are Germans making here? Nervous messes or violent thugs?" Rather than subject his soldiers to the trauma of close-quarter combat, Himmler concluded he needed to seek different means to reach the same goals. According to the memoirs of Rudolf Höss, commandant of Auschwitz, Adolf Eichmann suggested using showers of carbon monoxide while bathing, as was done with mental patients in some places in the Reich. The shower heads were not connected to sources of water. Rather, they were linked to canisters of carbon monoxide. The birth of this method had varied sources, including one ironic twist. Arthur Nebe, a Nazi killing squad commander, had come home drunk from a party one night and passed out in his garage with his car still running. The carbon monoxide gas from the exhaust nearly killed him. As he told his SS colleagues about the near miss, Nebe was convinced that gassing might be an effective weapon against Jews and other Nazi enemies. Gas would be cheaper than bullets, and no Nazi would directly take a life. So the Nazis tried out different experiments that involved using carbon monoxide. Deported Jews from the Lodz ghetto were taken through a subterranean hallway and then up a ramp to a tiny windowless chamber that turned out to be the cargo compartment of a huge van. Once the van was full, the doors were slammed shut, and as it was driven to a nearby forest, exhaust fumes were routed into the back, asphyxiating the trapped victims. When the van arrived at its site, the victims, after being removed from the vehicle, were either buried or burnt. The vans, while on the way to their destinations, the sidewalkers could hear the screams, but couldn't see the people. They were loaded in and murdered there. It was a living horror. That's why they referred to these vans as hell vans. Though the strategy was working for the Nazis, but they wanted to be even more efficient. And Auschwitz came up with the answer. The most efficient and successful method of mass murdering at Auschwitz was based on a pesticide that was also used to remove lice from the garments of the inmates. The disinfectant, sold under the trade name of Zyklon B, was in plentiful supply. Once exposed to properly heated air, the crystals produced lethal gas. At some point in the autumn of 1941, the basement of cell block 11 at Auschwitz which was the structure in which some of the most heinous forms of punishment were carried out, was walled off and locked down. August Kowalczyk, a Polish political prisoner who was sent to a nearby work assignment, saw everything that happened. He states that, since the Nazis were still experimenting, they made mistakes in their judgment, which led to the killings taking place over 2 days rather than the planned half hour. But that didn't stop them, and by the beginning of the spring of 1943, all 4 of Auschwitz II's, or Birkenau's, enormous crematoriums were running at full volume. They had 46 furnaces and 8 gas chambers, and together they had the capacity to dispose of around 4,400 bodies every single day. Trains would arrive at the camp, and those most fit, approximately 10 to 30% of the arrivals, would be selected for hard labor. The other inmates were herded into the cells that held the poison gas. SS men escorted the men, women, and children shortlisted for death to the gas chambers. Initially, to the gas chamber in Crematorium 1 and Bunkers 1 and 2, and from the spring of 1943, to the gas chambers in Crematoria 2, 3, 4, and 5. Some of those who couldn't walk were transported by trucks, while the rest went by foot. Before entering the gas chambers, these victims were asked to derobe. In Crematory 1, they disrobed either in the yard, which was enclosed by a wall, or in the antechamber. Wooden barracks were built for this purpose at Bunkers 1 and 2. And in Crematoria 2 through 5, there were special undressing rooms. In 1945, when there were a large number of transports arriving at Crematorium 5, the victims had no room to put off their clothes inside the walls, so they had to do that in the open air. To brace for their deaths, the Sonderkommando was housed within a specially constructed barracks that had been built in the Crematorium 4 undressing chamber. The members of the SS kept the individuals who were doomed to die from being informed of what was in store for them. They were told they would soon be transferred to the camp, but before that, they needed to get disinfected and take a shower. The victims were forced to strip before being led into the gas chamber, where they were then sealed in and put to death with Zyklon B gas. Following their deaths, inmates serving in the Sonderkommando were tasked with removing the bodies from the gas chambers. They took the women's jewelry and cut off their hair. The bodies were then incinerated in pits, pyres, or the furnaces of the crematoriums. Any bones that did not entirely disintegrate were crushed into a powder with pestles and then thrown, along with the ashes, into the rivers Soa and Vistula, or strewn in the fields as fertilizer, or used as landfill on uneven ground and in marshes. But in May of 1944, Auschwitz had a major bottleneck, given the ongoing deportation and killing of Hungarian Jews. The Hungarian Jews were the biggest Jewish population that stayed alive in Nazi-dominated Europe, numbering around 725,000 people, plus many more who were Christian converts, but still regarded as Jews under Nazi racial criteria. They were sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau in late April and early July of 1944, where the vast majority were gassed and buried. Burning bodies on pyres behind Crematorium 5 was once again the only option for disposing of the large number of corpses that were piling up, since the camp furnaces could no longer handle the load. There was no way that the Germans could bury the dead, everyone they killed during the Holocaust, no matter how much death technology they had at their disposal. So, they blew up the gas chambers and crematoria at Auschwitz as they retreated from the invading Allied troops in an effort to erase any proof that could have been left behind. But the evidence lingered. In camps throughout Poland and Germany, tens of thousands of bodies remained stacked or spilling out into the cold winter snow. There can never be an accurate tally of the number of people killed in concentration camps, given the fact that those who were marched off straight from the trains were often not documented, but a figure that is reasonable and also modest suggests that at least 1.1 million individuals were put to death by gas at Auschwitz alone, with the majority of these victims being Jewish.